The Summer Schloss, so called because the royal family had spent their summers there since records began, was a gleaming white confection of a building, a construction that had evidently been designed by whimsy with a little help from fancy and additional input by seemed like a good idea at the time. Frivolity stood in for symmetry. Excess replaced restraint. There were inaccessible turrets and redundant balconies. There were entrances that could not be entered and exits through which no one had ever successfully exited. The sprawling result was indeed palatial. It was also ridiculous, but no one who cared to keep his head attached to his body would dare say so. The current ruler, King Julian the Mighty, a Findleberg to his bones, enjoyed nothing more than commanding extensions be added to his favourite home, nothing more unless you counted ordering grisly executions, and he did so at the drop of a hat. Appearances would suggest that in the preceding several decades, hats had been dropping at a profligate rate. Gretel had not visited the Schloss since she was a girl. On that occasion, having made her escape from the gingerbread house, and after the actions of her parents had been exposed, King Julian had summoned her and her brother. In a previously unknown show of kingly concern for two of his subjects, the monarch had declared his intention to pay for the education of the youngsters, to provide them with suitable dwelling in the town, and to see that justice was done. Gretel suspected something of a PR exercise was afoot, but the king's motivations had never been completely clear. He may even have been moved by love, having only recently become engaged to the woman who was to become his second queen, the first having expired from her fruitless efforts to provide him with an heir. Whatever his reasons, the king was as good as his word. She and Hans had boarded at the very best of schools the realm could offer. On their return, they had moved into the modest but comfortable house they still enjoyed, and their father had been sent to the ruby mines of Ostfjorgen. He had actually been condemned to death by disemboweling with boar tusks, but had had his sentence commuted after Gretel had pleaded with the king for mercy. She had always hoped that one day she would be a guest at the Summer Schloss again. This was not, however, how she had seen the thing going in her daydreams. She was seated in the back of the wagon, trussed up like a chicken, back to back with the pungent farmer, being rattled to bone-jarring agony by the reckless pace with which the conveyance was being hauled Schlosswards by the troopers. The princess sat prettily behind one of the best-looking soldiers, her skirts trailing attractively in the breeze as his mount pranced along. Gretel feared that she herself would be forever tainted by her proximity to Bruder, and could only feel a cold dampness passing between them in her direction. Her hair had fought its way out of its pins and its lacquer to sprout wildly from beneath her toppling top hat. She was in no state to be presented to royalty. She drew some small comfort from the fact that she was at least well-dressed. The cart came to a stop in the courtyard to the rear of the Schloss. Gretel and Bruder were handled roughly as they were taken inside, frog-marched along endless corridors, the splendour of the interior a blur as they progressed. Gretel tried to marry her memory of the Schloss with what she was seeing, but so much had been altered, added to, or elaborated upon, it was hard to recognise anything. There were certainly staircases where none had been before, and windows too high to see out of, and a great many more tapestries hanging from lofty ceilings just about everywhere she looked. At last they came to a pair of enormous wooden doors, which were highly decorated with intricate carvings, picked out in the royal family colours of red and orange, and highlighted with gilt. The sergeant spoke to one of the guards at the entrance, who turned, raised his ceremonial axe, and used the hilt to knock slowly 4 times upon the great doors. There was a pause, and then the doors were opened from the inside, and the waiting party was ordered through the portal. The great hall was not a place for a friendly encounter, or an intimate rendezvous. The ceilings were so high, Gretel suspected they had their own weather, and were painted with lurid scenes depicting King Julian the Mighty in a bewildering range of heroic escapades and poses. The room was of such dimensions it could easily have accommodated the entire population of Gerstenstadt, and had space left over. The marble statues of royal forebears lined the walls to left and right. The floor was also of marble, in great slabs of varying colours, creating the curious effect that one was walking on a giant patchwork quilt. At the far end of the hall were broad steps, yet more marble, leading up to a dais upon which were positioned 5 thrones, one for each member of the royal family. The king sat on the largest of these, though it took Gretel some time to spot he was there at all. It had been nearly 30 years since she had seen the monarch, and it was fair to say those years had not been kind to him. In fact, they'd been downright nasty. Gretel recalled the fine, upright figure of a man who had smiled at her so benevolently when she had stood before him as a girl. She remembered broad shoulders, strong, lithe limbs, and a proud bearing. Now, in the unforgiving light that bounced off the profusion of cold stone and colour that surrounded them, she could just about make out a frail, crumpled old man, almost swamped by the cushions on which he had been placed. Gretel tried not to stare, but the change in her king was so dramatic and so unexpected she momentarily forgot her own precarious situation. No wonder, she thought, the king had long ago given up public appearances. He could hardly go out among his subjects looking like that. There was a word for his appearance, one unavoidable word: wizened. Not a good look for a king, especially when trying to live up to the nomenclature mighty. Behind him stood a small group of men. All were finely dressed and clearly important, but one struck Gretel as a cut above the others, even at first glance. He was tallish, darkish, and more than a little handsome. She shook away the possibility that Agnes might have been onto something. This was not the moment to be sizing up romantic possibilities. If the king lived up to his reputation, it would be a very long time indeed before she was at liberty to be troubled by thoughts of men in such a context. "In the name of King Julian," the sergeant's voice ricocheted off the surfeit of marble. "Kneel!" Gretel and Buddha did as they were told. The important men stepped forward for a better view of the wretches before them. Gretel felt humiliation warming her cheeks at the thought of the tufts of cotton sticking out of her shoes, the unmissable aroma of ammonia rising from her clothes, the unkempt condition of her hair, and her general state of dishevelment. She also felt her knees beginning to complain about their continued contact with the unyielding floor. The king stirred minutely on his bolsters. "Who are these people?" His voice had become as enfeebled as the rest of him. The sergeant bowed low as he addressed his monarch. "My liege," he yelled, "Princess Charlotte has been found. She was abducted by these two peasants." Gretel squirmed, attempting to straighten up. "I take issue with peasants." A heavily booted foot between her shoulder blades forced her back down. "Silence in the presence of King Julian," yelled one of the guards. "These two peasants," continued the sergeant at high volume, "who carried her away in their wagon in the direction of the town of Gerstenstadt with a nefarious intent to there secrete her in an unknown place for the purposes of extorting a ransom." "Where's he getting all this from?" Gretel wanted to know. "Silence!" hollered the guard. She winced as another boot struck home. The king flapped a flimsy hand. "What's he saying?" he asked his attendants. "What's this all about?" One of the important-looking men leaned close to the king's ear. "Princess Charlotte!" he shouted so loudly that Farmer Brewer yelped. "Charlotte?" The king was clearly having trouble recalling who that might be. "You mean Lottie? Dear little Lottie?" "Yes, your majesty," bellowed the attendant. "She's been found." "And these fellows found her?" The king's wrinkles rearranged themselves into what might once have been a smile. "Then we shall reward them handsomely." The sergeant was scandalised. "My liege!" The attendant tried again. "No, sire, these peasants are the ones who took her." "What's that you say?" A desperate note entered the aide's voice, giving it a shrillness that caused everyone in the room to flinch. "Abducted! Kidnapped! Stolen away!" he screamed. "No," said the king, still smiling. "Lottie's been found. It's all right, Klaus," he said, pointing at Gretel and Bruder. "These good people found my little girl and brought her home to me. Isn't that right, Sergeant?" The sergeant looked very much as if he might cry. At that moment the great doors opened once again and a flurry of females entered the hall. Princess Charlotte was at the vanguard of the little group. Gretel noticed the vixen had found time to change into something elegant and simple. She was aware of a burgeoning hatred for the girl, which was quickly blossoming into a full-grown loathing. "Papa!" Charlotte hurried to kiss her father. Her two sisters, her mother, and a collection of ladies in waiting swept along behind her, skirts rustling and swooshing as they came. "Oh, Papa, I was so frightened, afraid for my very life." There, my child." King Julian patted her hand with all the weight of a butterfly flapping in her palm. "You're safe now, home with your papa." The princess looked at Gretel and Bruder as if she had only just noticed them and shrieked, "Oh, those heinous villains!" Gretel risked opening her mouth. "There she goes again with this heinous business. I really must protest." The sergeant leapt at the opportunity to vent his frustration, or rather he leapt at Gretel. "In the name of King Julian, be silent," he insisted, flattening her against the floor once more, her nose squished painfully sideways upon a cerise square. Gretel was unsure whether it was the colour or the pressure that was making her eyes water. "I never abducted anyone in my life," she said from her squashed position. The king was beginning to catch up at last. "These people, Lottie, these are the ones who kidnapped you. Oh, Papa, it terrifies me merely to look upon them." Gretel found it hard to imagine how a piss-drenched old farmer and a woman with a soldier's foot on the back of her neck could inspire terror in anyone, let alone this determined, untruthful princess who clearly hadn't a scruple to her name. The king hauled himself to his feet, causing several of his attendants to rush to his sides to shore him up. From her unique perspective, Gretel could see that his feet were not actually touching the ground. "Off with their heads," he commanded. "Clap them in irons, throw them to the lions, have them hung, drawn and quartered, gouge out their eyes with dragon's teeth, burn them alive." The sergeant brightened visibly. "Forgive me, my king," he boomed, "but which would you like us to do first?" King Julian was in his stride now. "Boil them in oil, stretch them on the rack, drag out their entrails with mother's claws, pull off their ears with salad tongs." The Queen stepped in, placing a hand on her husband's arm. "Dearest, a little lie down, I think, and perhaps your medication?" She nodded to the aides who gently bore away their ranting royal master. One of the attendants, the one who was more good-looking than a person had a right to be, in Gretel's opinion, paused to speak to the sergeant. "Take them to the Schloss dungeons," he said, "and await further instructions." The situation may have been addling Gretel's senses, but she was fairly certain the man cast her a look of special significance before he turned and followed the raving monarch out of the great hall. End of chapter.